Welcome, everyone. As the night drifts in, let's take a journey through the pages of time and uncover another story from long time ago. Perhaps you're already lying in bed, chilling and relaxing, or just letting the past keep you company for a while. Where are you listening from tonight? Feel free to share in the comments. I always love hearing about your corner of the world. If these quiet stories of lives once lived bring you peace and comfort, I'd be truly glad and honored if you like and subscribe to this channel. And now, let's begin the story. The Wulver, a tale of the Shetland Isles. The northern wind, a relentless sculptor of land and spirit, howled across the bare shoulders of the Shetland hills. It carried the taste of salt and the distant, mournful cries of gulls from the Vos, those deep sea locks that bit into the land like the teeth of a great sea beast. The sky, a vast and bruised canopy of purple and gray, pressed down upon the world, its weight felt in the stoop of the heather and the shivering of the few stunted trees that dared to grow in that harsh place. This was a land shaped by elemental forces, a place where the boundary between the world of men and the world of myth felt thin and permeable, like a veil of fine sea mist. Within a secluded peat bog, nestled in a high glen forgotten by all but the sheep and the rain, the earth itself began to stir. This was not a violent motion. It possessed a slow, deliberate purpose, comparable to a seed pushing its first tender shoot through the dark soil. A section of the bog, a dense mat of sphagnum moss, heather roots, and ancient, compacted vegetation, began to swell. Water, black like strong tea, seeped from the growing mound. The air, previously filled only with the wind's lament, now hummed with a low, resonant vibration, a sound felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. The peat split, not with a crack, but with a soft, sighing release of trapped air that smelled of millennia. From within the fissure, a form began to extrude itself into the twilight. It was large, far larger than any natural creature of the Isles. Its shape was that of a man, but its covering was a thick, dense pelt the color of wet earth and winter bracken. The pelt clung to a frame of immense strength, with broad shoulders and long, powerful limbs. The process was slow, a birth measured in the passing of stars rather than moments. Finally, with a last, gentle push from the earth that had formed it, the creature lay fully upon the surface of the bog, the dark water cradling its body. Its chest rose and fell with a first shuddering breath. The air entering its lungs was sharp and cold, carrying a million scents. The damp peat, the far-off sea, the sweet bloom of bog myrtle, the musky scent of a rabbit warren a mile distant. Its senses, newborn and yet imprinted with an ancient knowledge, exploded into being. It opened its eyes. They were not the eyes of a man, nor wholly those of a wolf. They were a deep, warm amber, flecked with chips of gold that seemed to hold their own light. Those eyes held a profound and unsettling intelligence, a deep-seated melancholy, and a spark of primal wildness. There was no confusion in that gaze, only a slow, dawning awareness. It knew what it was, in the same way the wind knows to blow and the tide knows to turn. It was a Wulver, a spirit of the land, a creature born from the very soul of the Shetland earth, a bridge between the wilderness and the hearth. It pushed itself onto its haunches, water streaming from its thick fur. It looked at its own hands. They were large and capable, with strong, blunt fingers ending in dark, thick nails that were neither claw nor human nail, but something in between, perfectly suited for digging or for gentle work. It flexed them, feeling the power coiled in the tendons. The wind shifted, and a new scent came to it, carried from the east. Smoke. The scent of a human dwelling. And with that scent came a whisper on the edge of its consciousness, a purpose, as innate as breathing. It was a guardian, a watcher. Its existence was tied to this land and to the small, fragile creatures who huddled in stone cottages by the shore, who fought the sea and the soil for their survival. Rising to its full height, the Wulver stood for the first time upon the hill. It cast a long, dark shadow across the heather, a shadow that seemed to drink the fading light. It turned its face towards the distant source of the smoke, its amber eyes narrowing in contemplation. It felt no urge to roar its arrival to the sky. Its nature was quiet, observant. It was a creature of deeds, not declarations. With a gait that was both graceful and powerful, a rolling motion that spoke of a body built for endurance over speed, it began to move. It left the peat bog, its large, bare feet making deep impressions in the soft ground, a trail that would be washed away by the next rain. It did not head directly for the human scent. Instead, it moved towards a high ridge that overlooked the wide expanse of the sea and the scattered lights of a small village clinging to the shoreline far below. It found a flat stone, still warm from a sun that had long since vanished, and sat. It drew its knees to its chest, wrapping its long arms around them. The posture was not one of vulnerability, but of patient waiting. The wind tugged at its shaggy fur. The stars began to prick the velvet darkness above. The Wulver did not move. It simply watched. It watched the lights in the village, one by one, flicker and go out as the people settled for the night. It listened to the rhythm of the waves crashing against the cliffs, a timeless lullaby for this newborn, ancient thing. Its first night was spent in silent vigil, a solitary sentinel on the high hill, its amber eyes keeping watch over a world it was made to understand, to guard, and to serve in its own mysterious way. The journey, its journey, had begun not with a departure, but with an arrival and a choice to watch, to learn, and to wait for the moment its purpose would call it down from the heights. The first lessons of land and sea. Dawn came to the Shetland Isles not with a triumphant fanfare of color, but with a slow, gray dilution of the night. The clouds, perpetual residents of the northern sky, lightened from charcoal to a soft, pearlescent gray. A thin, persistent drizzle began to fall, beating on the Wulver's thick pelt like dew on spiderwebs. It had not slept. Its body thrummed with a vitality that needed no rest, an energy drawn from the living land itself. The hunger, however, was a new and pressing sensation. A hollow ache deep within its belly demanded to be filled. It uncurled from its seated position, the joints of its large frame moving with a soft, leathery creak. The world of scent, so overwhelming upon its emergence, had now settled into a complex and readable language. It could separate the individual threads: the wet wool scent of a ewe on a distant slope, the sharp tang of a fox's passage from hours before, the sweet decay of fallen rowan berries. But the most potent scent, the one that called to the gnawing in its stomach, was the smell of water and the life within it. It moved down from the high ridge, its passage silent and fluid. Its large feet, with their leathery soles, found secure purchase on the slippery rocks and spongy moss. It moved through the landscape like a shadow given substance, disturbing nothing. The cries of oyster-catchers echoed from the shore, their black and white plumage stark against the gray stones. The Wulver paused, its gaze following their flight. They were not its prey. Their purpose was not its purpose. It reached the edge of a voe, a narrow inlet where the sea lay calm, protected from the wrath of the open ocean. The water was dark, a mirror to the sky, its surface ruffled by the drizzle. The Wulver stood at the water's edge, its reflection staring back. A tall, shaggy, canine-headed figure rippling in the pewter-colored water. It felt no alienation from this image. This was its truth. It waded into the sea. The cold was a shock, but not an unpleasant one. It was a bracing embrace. The water soaked its fur, making it heavy, but the Wulver was a strong swimmer, its body naturally buoyant, and its limbs powerful paddles. It did not swim with frantic strokes. Instead, it moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its head barely breaking the surface, its amber eyes fixed on the world beneath. Below, the sea was a garden of kelp, the long, brown fronds swaying in the gentle underwater current. Small, silvery fish darted in shimmering schools. A crab scuttled sideways over a rock. The Wulver's eyes, capable of gathering the faintest light, pierced the gloom. It was not looking for the small fish. It was waiting for a different signature, a different rhythm. It waited, suspended in the cold, salt water, its breathing slow and controlled. Time lost its meaning. It became a part of the sea, a rock, a piece of drifting kelp. Then it saw it, a larger, darker shape moving through the kelp forest with a lazy flick of its tail. A cod, fat and speckled, its white belly a faint glow in the deep. The Wulver did not thrash or chase. It remained perfectly still. Its right hand, hanging loosely by its side, tensed. The fingers curled slightly. It watched the fish's pattern, its casual, meandering path. It calculated the speed of the current, the distance. Its entire being focused into a single point of intent. The strike was too fast for the human eye to follow. Its hand shot into the water with the precision of a heron's beak. There was no splash, only a sudden, violent disruption of the water's surface, and then the Wulver was holding the cod, its grip firm behind the gills. The fish thrashed for a moment, a final, desperate protest, then fell still. The Wulver waded back to shore, the dripping fish in its hand. It settled on a flat rock above the tide line, the drizzle still misting the air. With a deft motion of its thick nails, it cleaned the fish, its movements economical and practiced, an innate knowledge guiding its hands. It ate the flesh, raw and cool, and tasting of the deep sea. The hunger receded, replaced by a deep, satisfying fullness. This was its first successful hunt, a quiet, solitary sacrament. After its meal, it walked along the shoreline, its senses still tuned to the environment. It found a length of driftwood, pale and smooth, shaped by the sea. It picked it up, feeling its weight and grain. An impulse, a flicker of something beyond mere survival, stirred within it. Using one of its strong nails, it began to scrape at the wood. It was not carving a specific shape. It was simply following the lines of the grain, smoothing a rough patch, letting its hands explore the potential of the material. This too felt like a remembered skill, a need to create, to leave a subtle mark. The day wore on, the drizzle ceased, and a weak silvery light broke through the clouds. The Wulver, its hunger sated and its spirit calm, climbed back to its high vantage point. It looked down at the village. It saw a small figure, a child, chasing a chicken outside a croft. It saw a woman hanging washing on a line, the white sheets snapping in the wind. It saw a man mending a fishing net, his movements slow and tired. The Wulver felt a new sensation, a pull in its chest that was different from hunger. It was a feeling of connection, of responsibility. These small, busy creatures, with their short lives and their struggles against the elements, they were under its watch. It did not know how it would fulfill this duty, only that it must. It sat once more upon the warm stone, the piece of smooth driftwood held in its hand, and resumed its vigil, a silent, patient guardian learning the rhythms of its charge. The whisper in the reeds. Weeks bled into months, marked by the turning of the moon and the slow greening change of the hills. The Wulver fell into a rhythm, a solitary dance with the land. Its existence became a tapestry woven from silent observation and instinctual action. It knew every hidden burn that carved its way through the peat, every seabird colony clinging to the cliff faces, every sheltered crevice where the wind's bite was blunted. It was a creature of immense physical power, yet its life was one of profound quietude. Its days began with the first paling of the eastern sky. It would leave the high ridge, its fur silvered with condensation, and descend to the Vaux for its morning hunt. The sea was its larder, and its skill with the spear-like thrust of its hand became unparalleled. It could discern the subtle difference between the shadow of a cod and that of a haddock, between the lazy drift of a flounder on the sandy bottom and the quick, nervous energy of a mackerel. It took only what it needed, its connection to the land forbidding waste. After its meal, it would often spend the hours of the day exploring, its long, rolling stride carrying it across miles of rugged coastline and deep into the silent, treeless interior. One afternoon, while following the course of a tumbling, peat-stained stream, it came upon a sight that gave it pause. A small brown trout had become stranded in a shallow pool, cut off from the main flow by a recent shift of stones. The fish flicked its tail in a frantic, hopeless rhythm, its gills flaring. The Wulver watched it for a long time, its head tilted. The instinct to simply pluck the easy meal was strong, a primal urge. But a deeper impulse, a thread of something more complex than hunger, stayed its hand. It knelt by the pool, its large form blocking the sun. With immense care, it used its hands to dig a channel from the main stream back to the isolated pool. The water, cold and clear, rushed in, swirling around the stranded trout. For a moment, the fish remained still, stunned by its sudden deliverance. Then, with a powerful flick, it vanished into the deeper, darker water of the stream. The Wulver felt a sensation, a quiet hum of satisfaction that was entirely separate from the feeling of a full belly. It had not taken a life. It had returned one to its proper course. This was a new kind of knowledge, a subtle law written not in its muscles but in its spirit. It was on its return journey to the high ridge, with the long lavender shadows of evening stretching across the land, that it encountered the first direct evidence of the hardship it had sensed from afar. It moved through a stand of tall, whispering reeds near the mouth of a burn that fed into the sea. The wind shifted, and a new scent came to it, one that made the fine hairs on its neck rise. It was the scent of human despair, a bitter compound of hunger, damp wool, and cold ashes. Crouching low, its form blending completely with the shadows and the reeds, the Wulver looked upon a scene that etched itself into its memory. It was a croft, smaller and more dilapidated than the others it had observed. The roof was patched with ragged turf, and one wall sagged inward. A thin peat smoke trickled from the chimney, a weak and struggling breath against the vastness of the sky. Outside, a man sat on a low stone, his head in his hands. His shoulders shook, not from the cold, but from a silent, tearing sob. The Wulver's keen hearing picked up the faint, hungry wail of an infant from within the cottage. A woman emerged, her face pale and drawn, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin frame. She placed a hand on the man's shuddering back. Her words, carried on the wind, were fragments of sorrow. "The last of the meal, Ian. The bairn cries. The sea gives us nothing." The man, Ian, looked up, his face a mask of anguish. "The boat is splinters, Moira. The nets are torn. The sea has turned its back on me." The Wulver watched, motionless. It understood the language of the body, the postures of defeat. This was a different kind of struggle from the fox hunting the rabbit or the eagle battling the wind. This was a slow, grinding defeat of the spirit. The purpose it had felt upon its emergence, the whisper of guardianship, now had a face, a sound, a scent. It remained hidden until full dark had fallen, and the single flickering light in the cottage's small window had been extinguished. The silence from the croft was heavier than the darkness, thick with a hopelessness that even the wind could not scatter. The Wulver moved then. It turned and loped back towards the Voe, its movements swift and sure in the starlit darkness. It waded into the black water, its amber eyes piercing the depths. This time, its hunt was not for itself. It sought a specific fish, a large, healthy cod, a symbol of plenty. It found one, sleeping near a kelp-covered rock. The strike was as silent and efficient as ever. Instead of consuming its catch, it carried the heavy, cold fish back through the night. It approached the silent croft with the caution of a stalking creature, its senses stretched to their limit. It could hear the slow, deep breathing of the exhausted man and the fretful, shallow breaths of the woman and child. It crept to the rough wooden door. There was no latch, only a simple leather thong looped over a nail to keep it shut against the wind. With an infinite slowness that belied its size, the Wulver reached out and lifted the thong from the nail. It did not open the door. It laid the cod, gleaming faintly in the starlight, upon the flat stone that served as a doorstep. It was a large fish, enough to feed the small family for 2 days. It then retreated, melting back into the tapestry of the night, leaving behind only the gift and the mystery. The following dawn, it was in its accustomed place on the high ridge when the cottage door creaked open. The woman, Moira, stepped out, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Her gaze fell to the doorstep. She froze. A small cry, part shock, part disbelief, escaped her lips. She knelt, her fingers touching the cold, firm flesh of the fish as if to confirm it was real. She called out for Ian, her voice trembling with a fragile, rekindled hope. The Wulver, watching from its distant perch, saw the man emerge, his face transformed from the despair of the previous evening to a look of stunned wonder. He looked around, his eyes scanning the empty hills, finding nothing but the grazing sheep and the endless sky. He lifted the fish, holding it up like a sacrament. The Wulver felt that strange hum of satisfaction once more, deeper and more resonant this time. It had not shown itself. It had not asked for thanks. It had simply acted, a force of nature intervening in the quietest way possible. It had mended a break in the stream of a life, just as it had for the stranded trout. And in that moment, the course of its own existence was set. It was a guardian, yes, but its method would be one of silent, anonymous gifts, left in the dark to be discovered with the dawn. The rhythm of the secret gift. The leaving of the fish became a new rhythm, a sacred ritual woven into the fabric of the Wulver's days. It was no longer a solitary spirit of the wild. It had become a silent partner in the lives of the people below. Its watchfulness took on a specific, targeted focus. It learned to read the signs of poverty and distress from its high vantage point with the acuity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. It noted the crofts where the peat smoke was thinnest, a telltale sign of a dwindling fuel supply. It observed the patches of kale and potatoes that grew sparse and stunted, their leaves yellowing from poor soil or lack of care. It listened for the absence of certain sounds, the cheerful ring of an axe splitting wood, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal, and for the presence of others, the raised, anxious voices of arguments born of hunger and fear, the persistent, worrying cough from a poorly insulated home. Its territory of care expanded. The first family, Ian and Moira and their babe, received a fish every few days, enough to stave off the sharpest pangs of hunger, but not so much to be wasteful. The Wulver understood balance in all things. It then turned its attention to an old woman who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the village, her back bent like a weathered hook. It watched her struggle to carry water from the well, her hands knotted with age. One evening, a plump haddock appeared on her chopping block. It learned the patterns of the village, the times when doors were shut and lanterns were doused. It moved through the sleeping settlement like a fragment of the night itself, a deeper shadow among shadows. Its passage was so silent that the dogs, usually keen to bark at any disturbance, would only prick their ears and whine softly, sensing a presence that was ancient and fundamentally non-threatening. They smelled the wildness on it, the scent of peat and cold salt spray, but they also smelled a profound, deep-rooted calm that quelled their instinct to alarm. One evening, under a sky bruised with the threat of a spring storm, the Wulver encountered a new challenge. It was carrying a fine, silver-scaled saithe for the old woman when it heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. A young man, one of the village fishermen, was returning late from mending his nets down at the shore. There was no time to hide, no cover but the deep gloom between two cottages. The Wulver froze, becoming a statue of shadow and fur. The young man, humming a tired tune, walked within 10 feet of its position. He stopped. He peered into the darkness, his eyes wide. The Wulver held its breath, its amber eyes unblinking. It could feel the young man's fear, a sharp, acrid scent that cut through the damp air. The young man made a sign with his hand, a quick, superstitious gesture to ward off evil. He muttered a name, not the Wulver's true name, but a local folk name for a mischievous, lesser spirit. Then he hurried on, his footsteps quickening to a run. The Wulver remained in the shadows for a long time after the sound of the man's flight had faded. It had been seen. Not clearly, not in a way that its full form was understood, but its presence had been registered. It felt a new, unfamiliar emotion, a prickle of vulnerability. Its power lay in its secrecy, in its anonymity. To be known was to be at risk. The following night, it approached the old woman's cottage with even greater caution. It half expected the gift to be rejected, the fish to lie untouched, tainted by the superstition it now represented. But when it arrived, the fish from the previous night was gone. In its place, on the corner of the chopping block, was a small, rough-made bannock, a flat oatcake. It was a simple thing, dry and hard, but it was placed there with clear intention. The Wulver stared at the bannock, its meaning unfolding slowly in its mind. It was not a payment. Such a concept was foreign to its nature. It was an acknowledgement, a connection, a silent, "I know you are there, and I thank you." It reached out a long-fingered hand and picked up the oatcake. It was dense and plain. It ate it, the coarse texture a stark contrast to the soft flesh of the fish. The taste was of the earth, of roasted oats and hearth smoke. It was the first human food it had ever consumed, and it tasted like trust. This small, silent exchange became part of the ritual. The Wulver would leave its fish, and sometimes, not always, a small token would be left in return. A bannock, a handful of blaeberries placed on a clean leaf, a simple hand-whittled peg of wood. The gifts were never lavish, never enough to sustain the Wulver, which drew its true sustenance from the land itself. Their value was purely symbolic, a thread of mutual, unspoken understanding woven between the wild and the domestic. The Wulver's life, which had once been a solitary dialogue with the wind and the waves, was now a conversation. It learned that its exceptional ability was not merely its strength or its hunting skill, but its profound capacity for empathy, a deep, wordless understanding of need. It was a skill that grew with every gift it left, with every small sign of relief it witnessed from its high perch. It was becoming a legend, not a frightening one told to children around the fire, but a quiet, hopeful secret shared between the desperate and the kind, a secret that lived in the space between the darkness and the dawn. The storm-kindled hearth. The seasons in Shetland did not turn with the gentle persuasion found in softer lands. They were wrestled from one another in a constant, elemental struggle. The hesitant green of summer was now being brutally scourged by the gales of late autumn. The wind, which had once been a persistent presence, became a screaming fury, tearing at the thatch of the cottages and whipping the sea into a boiling cauldron of white foam and gray water. The sky was a lid of low, fast-moving cloud, the color of lead and slate. From its ridge, the Wulver watched the transformation of its world. It felt the change in the very pressure of the air, a tightening in its chest. Its thick pelt, now grown even denser and longer, rippled in the gusts, shedding the rain that fell not in drops, but in driving, horizontal sheets. The sky was a lid of low, fast-moving cloud, the color of lead and slate. From its ridge, the Wulver watched the transformation of its world. It felt the change in the very pressure of the air, a tightening in its chest. Its thick pelt, now grown even denser and longer, rippled in the gusts, shedding the rain that fell not in drops, but in driving, horizontal sheets. It saw the fishing boats, tiny walnut shells, being hauled far above the tide line, their sails furled and their nets stored. The sea was no longer a provider, it was a ravenous beast, and the village had withdrawn behind a defensive line of stone and prayer. This was when the Wulver's work became most critical. The hidden hunger of summer, the quiet desperation it had learned to assuage, was now an open, gnawing threat. With the boats landbound, the primary source of food was severed. The stores of dried fish, the sacks of oats, the few root vegetables in the kylie yards, these were the fragile bulwarks against the long, dark months. The Wulver descended from the heights, its form a solid, dark mass moving against the wind's torrent. It did not fight the gale, it leaned into it, its low center of gravity and powerful legs granting it a stability that no human could possess. The hunt in the Vaux was now a battle. The water was a churning chaos, the kelp forests thrashed and torn. The fish had sought the deeper, calmer waters, far from the tumult of the shore. It took all of the Wulver's skill and patience. It swam against powerful currents, its head dipping beneath waves that would have dashed a man against the rocks. Its amber eyes, gifted with the ability to see in the murky, sediment-filled water, scanned the depths for any sign of life. It was a test of its very nature, a trial by water and wind. On the first day of the great storm, it caught only a single, small kibbling. It was not enough. A new, urgent drive kindled within it. It ranged farther, beyond its usual hunting grounds, to a more sheltered inlet where the cliffs took the brunt of the ocean's anger. Here, in the relative calm, it found a small school of sathe sheltering near an underwater cave. It hunted with a focused intensity, its movements economical and ruthless. It caught 3 large fish, their sides flashing silver in the turbulent water. Carrying them back through the storm was its own epic journey, a saga of endurance witnessed only by the crying gulls and the salt spray. That night, the village was a cluster of huddled lights, each cottage an island besieged by the roaring dark. The Wulver moved through the lanes, the wind masking any sound of its passage. It went first to Ian and Moira's croft. The hungry cry of the child, now a toddler, was sharp, a needle of sound piercing the gale's roar. The Wulver laid 2 of the sathe on the doorstep, placing a heavy stone upon them to prevent the wind from stealing them. It then carried the 3rd fish to the old woman's cottage. Her home was more exposed than the others, and it shuddered with every powerful gust. As it approached, a new sound reached its ears, not the cry of a child, but the old woman's voice raised in a quavering song. It was a traditional ballad of lost love and wandering spirits. The voice was thin and cracked, but it held a defiant threat of courage, a refusal to be silenced by the storm. The Wulver paused, listening. The sound stirred something deep within its memory, a racial memory of humans huddled around fires, using story and song to push back the terror of the unknown. It left the fish on her chopping block, sheltered by an overhanging eave. As it turned to go, its eye caught a flicker of movement in the single, small window. The old woman was there, her face a pale moon in the darkness, pressed against the thick, greenish glass. She was looking out, not with fear, but with a searching, hopeful expression. The Wulver knew, with a certainty that was beyond logic, that she was looking for it. It did not flee. It stood its ground, allowing her to see the dark, solid outline of its form against the howling night. For a long moment they remained thus, the ancient woman inside her fragile shell of stone, and the ancient spirit outside in the heart of the tempest. Then, slowly, the Wulver inclined its head, a brief, deliberate gesture. The old woman's hand came up, her fingers pressed to the glass in a silent salute. Then it was gone, back into the swirling darkness. Inside the cottage, the old woman, whose name was Elspeth, lowered her hand. A tear, not of sorrow, but of profound, soul-deep recognition, traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. She had seen the Wulver. She had looked into the myth that left fish at her door, and she had found not a monster, but a guardian. The storm continued to rage, but the fear in her heart had been quieted, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the meager fire in her hearth. The following morning, when Ian ventured out to check for damage, he found the 2 large save. He brought them inside, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from a feeling of awe. "Moira," he whispered, holding up the gleaming fish. "The storm, it brought us a blessing." Moira looked at the fish, then out the window at the still raging sea. "It was not the storm, Ian," she said softly, her voice full of a new and certain faith. "It was the quiet one, the one who walks in the wind." The Wulver, high on its ridge, watched Ian emerge and retrieve the gift. It felt the shift in the village's energy. The desperation that had thickened the air the day before had been leavened by this small miracle. It understood then that its purpose was not merely to fill bellies, but to kindle hope. It was the spark in the darkness, the assurance that even in the most violent of storms, a silent watch was being kept. Its own heart, a wild and lonely engine, felt a corresponding warmth. It was not part of the village. It would never sit by a human hearth, but it was bound to these people by a covenant of compassion, a bond forged in the fiercest of fires and proven in the heart of the gale. The shadow of the stranger. With the passing of the great storm, a fragile calm descended upon the islands. The sea, exhausted by its own fury, lay flat and calm, reflecting a sky of washed-out blue. The village, having survived the trial, buzzed with a renewed energy. The boats were launched, the nets were cast, and life returned to its familiar, arduous rhythm. The Wulver's gifts, while still appreciated, were no longer a matter of survival. Its watchfulness, however, did not diminish. It was during this time of recovery that a new element was introduced to the Wulver's world. A ship, different from the sturdy, familiar fishing yawls, put into the small harbor. It was a wider, heavier vessel from the south, its sails patched and its timbers stained dark with long travel. From its deck emerged a man who was not like the crofters and fishermen. The Wulver observed him from the ridge. The man moved with a swagger that was alien to the careful, economical movements of the islanders. His clothes were of a finer, darker cloth, and he wore a hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried himself with an air of ownership, his gaze sweeping over the village and the surrounding hills, not with appreciation, but with calculation. The scent that came from him on the rare shifts of the wind was complex, a mix of foreign tobacco, cheap whiskey, and a deep, avaricious hunger that had nothing to do with an empty stomach. This man, who called himself Magnus Tite, though it was not the name he was born with, took a room at the only inn, a low, smoky building near the pier. He spent his days not fishing or mending, but talking. He bought drinks for the fishermen, his voice a smooth, persuasive instrument. He spoke of money to be made, of opportunities in the south, of the value of things the islanders took for granted. The Wulver felt a deep, instinctual dislike for this man. It was a feeling that sat in its gut like a cold stone. Where the islanders' emotions were an open book, their joy, their sorrow, their fear, this man's heart was a locked box, his smiles never reaching his eyes. The village dogs, who had grown accustomed to the Wulver's benign presence, would growl low in their throats when Magnus Tite passed by. The stranger's interest soon turned to the one thing that set this village apart from others he had exploited. In the inn one evening, his voice slick with false camaraderie, he leaned in towards a group of fishermen, including Ian. "I hear tales," he began, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Stories of a guardian spirit, a creature that leaves fish for the poor. They say it's a lucky thing, a sign of God's favor." Ian shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty to the silent benefactor warring with a natural caution. "Aye, well," he muttered into his ale, "the sea provides in strange ways." "Does it now?" Magnus's smile was thin and sharp. "Or does something else provide? A creature, they say, with the look of a man, but the pelt of a wolf. They call it a Wulver." He let the word hang in the air, heavy with implication. "A thing like that, it's not just a story, it's a commodity. Think of the men from the cities, the lords with their curiosity cabinets. They would pay a king's ransom for the pelt of such a beast. They would pay to see it, to own it." A silence fell over the group. The idea was a poison seeping into their minds. The Wulver was their secret, their quiet miracle. To speak of it in terms of money and capture felt like a sacrilege. The Wulver, listening from the darkness outside the inn's single window, understood the threat not in the specifics of the words, but in the man's intent. The scent of greed was overwhelming, a corrosive acid that threatened to dissolve the delicate web of trust it had built. This man was a different kind of storm, one that could not be weathered by strength or patience alone. Its routine changed. It became more ghost than guardian. Its gifts were left with even greater stealth, its appearances so fleeting they were like tricks of the light. It watched Magnus tight with the unblinking focus it usually reserved for hunting. It saw him questioning the children, offering them sweet treats for information. It saw him walking the hills in the daytime, his eyes scanning the heather not for beauty but for tracks. One afternoon, the Wulver was concealed within a dense thicket of willow scrub near the high moor when Magnus Tight passed by, not 50 yards away. The man held a musket, its polished wood and metal barrel gleaming dully in the gray light. He was not looking for grouse or hare. His gaze was fixed on the ground, searching for the large, distinctive footprints that the Wulver usually took care to hide. The Wulver remained perfectly still, its breathing shallow. It felt the cold weight of the man's presence, a blight upon the clean, wild land. This was a hunter, but his quarry was not food. It was mystery itself. He sought to tear the heart out of the legend and pin it to a board for display. That night, the Wulver did not deliver a fish. Instead, it went to the cottage of Elspeth, the old woman. It did not approach the door. It went to the window. Tapping lightly on the thick glass with one long nail, it waited. Elspeth appeared, her face showing no surprise. She opened the small window, the wind catching the tendrils of her white hair. She looked into the amber eyes that glowed in the darkness. "He seeks you," she whispered, her voice rough with urgency. "The stranger with the hungry eyes, he means you harm." The Wulver made a low sound in its throat, a rumble that was neither growl nor purr, but an acknowledgement. "You must be careful," Elspeth implored. "Go deep into the hills. Do not come down for a time." The Wulver looked at her, this frail human who saw it so clearly. It then did something it had never done before. It reached a hand towards the window. Slowly, it laid something on the stone sill, not a fish, but a single, perfect white feather from a sea eagle. A symbol of freedom, of the high, untouchable places. Elspeth picked up the feather, her eyes shining. She understood. It was a message. It would not be driven away. It would not hide. It would remain, but it would be even more a creature of the mist, a phantom in the landscape, a guardian who knew that its greatest threat was no longer the hunger of the winter, but the boundless greed of man. The shadow of the stranger had fallen, and the Wulver's solitary war for its own existence had quietly begun. The Phantom of the Peat Moss. The presence of Magnus Tate festered in the village like a splinter working its way deep into flesh. The easy camaraderie of the inn was now strained, fractured by the stranger's insidious whispers and the clink of his silver. The Wulver, from its high perch, observed the subtle schism. It saw how some men, their own pockets thin and their futures uncertain, would glance towards the hills with a new, calculating light in their eyes when Magnus spoke. The legend of the gentle spirit was being slowly, deliberately, twisted into a tale of a valuable quarry. The Wulver's existence contracted into a state of heightened vigilance. Its movements became spectral. Its passages through the landscape so meticulously planned they left less trace than the passing of a fog. It learned to walk on the windward side of the sheep trails to keep its scent from drifting, to place its feet on stone rather than soft earth, to hunt in the blackest, moonless hours when even the owls were blind. It was a phantom of the peat moss, a rumor given fleeting form. Magnus Tight, frustrated by the lack of clear evidence and the villagers' growing reticence, grew bolder. He began to venture out at night, a dark lantern in one hand and his musket in the other. He was a city man, clumsy and loud in the wilderness. his progress marked by snapped twigs and muttered curses. But his persistence was a threat. He set crude snares made of strong wire along game paths. He left offerings of salted meat in clearings, hoping to lure the creature into a false sense of security. The Wulver found these traps with a sense of profound disgust. They were insults to the intelligence of the wild. It would dismantle them with swift, efficient movements, coiling the wire and burying the poisoned bait deep in the earth. It never left a sign of its work, wanting the man to doubt his own mind, to wonder if the wind and rain had undone his efforts. One evening, a dense haar, a cold, wet sea fog, rolled in from the North Sea, blanketing the islands in an impenetrable gray-white shroud. The world shrank to a circle of a few feet. Sounds were muffled, and shapes loomed and dissolved like half-remembered dreams. It was a perfect cloak for the Wulver. It moved through the fog like a swimmer through deep water, its amber eyes seeing the heat of the land, reading the world in a spectrum invisible to man. It was on such a night that it decided to deliver a fish to a young family whose father had broken his leg in a fall from the cliffs. The need was great, and the fog provided cover. It carried a fine cod, its body cool and firm in its grip, and slipped into the village. The place was eerily silent, the familiar outlines of the cottages swallowed by the mist. It reached the family's doorstep and laid its gift down. A click, metallic and final, shattered the silence. From the wall of fog beside the cottage, a figure emerged. Magnus Tite, his face a pale, triumphant mask, lowered his lantern, its beam cutting a weak, yellow path through the gloom. He held his musket, its barrel now leveled directly at the Wulver's chest. "Still," he commanded, his voice tight with excitement, "do not move, beast." The Wulver froze. It was not fear it felt, but a cold, clear assessment of the situation. The distance between them was 20 paces. The man's finger was tense on the trigger. The scent of gunpowder and nervous sweat was sharp in the damp air. "I have you," Magnus whispered, his eyes wide. "I have the legend itself." The Wulver did not look at the musket. It looked into the man's eyes. It saw the greed, the hunger for notoriety and wealth, the complete absence of wonder or respect. In that moment, it understood the core of the man's soul, and it found it to be a small, barren place. Slowly, with an infinite and deliberate slowness that seemed to stretch time itself, the Wulver straightened to its full height. It was taller, broader, more powerfully built than Magnus had ever imagined. It was not a shambling monster. It was a sovereign presence, a king of the mist. Its amber eyes, catching the lantern light, seemed to ignite from within, glowing with a primal, ancient light. It took a single step forward, not a threatening lunge, but a calm, deliberate advance. Magnus Tite's confidence wavered. The beast was supposed to cower, to flee. It was not supposed to look at him with such piercing, intelligent contempt. His hand began to shake. The musket, which had felt so solid and decisive a moment before, now felt like a flimsy stick. The Wulver took another step. The low, rumbling sound it had made for Elspeth now vibrated in its chest, deeper and more resonant. It was not a growl of aggression, but a sound of power, a fundamental vibration that seemed to make the very fog tremble. "Stay back!" Magnus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He fired. The explosion was deafening in the muffled world of the fog. The flash of the pan was a brief, violent star in the gray. The ball, fired in a spasm of fear, went wide, zipping past the Wulver's shoulder and thudding into the peat wall of the cottage behind it. The Wulver did not flinch. It did not even acknowledge the shot. It took one more step, now standing over the cowering man. The scent of his terror was thick, a sour tang that overwhelmed the smell of the powder. The Wulver looked down at him, at the pitiful figure huddled on the ground, the useless musket now clutched like a child's toy. It could have ended him then. One swipe of its powerful hand could have silenced the threat forever, but that was not its way. Its purpose was to preserve life, not to extinguish it, even one us worthless as this. Instead, it leaned down, its face close to Magnus' tights. It let the man see the full force of its gaze, to feel the wild, untamable spirit that looked out from those golden eyes. Then it exhaled a warm breath that smelled of peat and the deep sea onto the man's face. It was a dismissal, a branding. Then it turned and walked away, melting back into the wall of fog from which it had come. In 3 heartbeats, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The only evidence of its presence was the cod lying on the doorstep and the trembling, urine-soaked form of Magnus Tight, left alone in the silent, mocking fog. The legacy of the feather. The following morning, the har burned away under a weak sun, revealing a world washed clean. The incident at the croft was the sole topic of conversation in the village. Magnus Tight was found, shivering and incoherent, by the returning father of the household. The man was too terrified to speak clearly, muttering only about demons and burning eyes. His musket was found, unfired, to any who inspected it properly, its ball embedded harmlessly in the wall. The cod, however, was real. The message was clear to all. The stranger's power was broken. His whispers now sounded like the ravings of a madman. The men who had been tempted by his silver looked at him with pity and a newfound distrust. His authority, built on confidence and coin, evaporated overnight. Within 2 days, he was on a southbound trading vessel, his tail between his legs, his dreams of wealth replaced by a chilling memory he would carry to his grave. The village, in the stranger's wake, felt a collective sense of relief, followed by a deepening of the silent covenant with their guardian. The Wulver had not merely provided, it had protected. It had defended its own mystery, and, in doing so, had defended the soul of the place itself. It had shown its power not through violence, but through an immovable, majestic will. The Wulver itself felt a shift. The immediate threat was gone, but the experience had left a mark. It had been seen, truly seen, in a moment of confrontation. Its anonymity, while still largely intact, now had a crack in it. It knew that its continued existence depended on the discretion of the entire village, a fragile thing that could be shattered by a single voice in the wrong company. It was Elspeth who formalized the understanding. Though frail, her spirit was the strongest in the village. She summoned Ian and a few other respected crofters to her cottage. The white sea eagle feather, given to her by the Wulver, lay on the table between them. "The Quiet One has shown us its heart," she said, her voice thin but firm. "It has given us food in our hunger and courage in our fear. The stranger showed us what happens when greed tries to touch what is sacred. We must be its guardians now. Us, it is ours." Ian nodded, his face serious. "Aye, the children must be taught not to chase after it, not to speak of it to any who come from outside our isles. It is our secret, our burden, and our blessing." "It is more than that," Elspeth insisted, her finger touching the soft veins of the feather. "It is a trust. We are the keepers of the Wulver's legend. We must ensure the story is told rightly. Not us a tale of a monster to be feared or a prize to be won, but us a story of kindness, a story that reminds us that the wild is not always our enemy. A pact was made that day, not written on paper, but etched into the hearts of those present. They would be the silent custodians of the myth. They would control the narrative, ensuring that within their community, the Wulver was spoken of with reverence, and to the outside world, it was mentioned only as a quaint folktale, a fancy not to be taken seriously. The Wulver, observing from afar, sensed the consolidation of this human wall around it. The gifts left for it became more frequent, more heartfelt. A newly knitted thick woolen sock appeared on a stone near its high ridge, a protection against the coming winter cold. A small carved wooden bowl of fresh cream was left at the edge of the moor. These were no longer mere acknowledgments, they were acts of devotion, of partnership. Its own actions evolved in response. It began to range farther afield, its guardianship expanding beyond the immediate village. It found a lost lamb from a distant croft and herded it gently back to its mother. It would sometimes clear a landslide from a path after a heavy rain, using its immense strength to roll aside stones that would have taken men hours to move. These were no longer mere acknowledgments, they were acts of devotion, of partnership. Its own actions evolved in response. It began to range farther afield, its guardianship expanding beyond the immediate village. It found a lost lamb from a distant croft and herded it gently back to its mother. It would sometimes clear a landslide from a path after a heavy rain, using its immense strength to roll aside stones that would have taken men hours to move. Its life settled into a new, more profound rhythm. The frantic stealth of the hunting season was replaced by a calm, assured presence. It was no longer just a phantom. It was a fixture, a natural part of the ecosystem of the island, as integral as the sea eagles and the otters. It was the heart of the place, a wild, beating heart that sustained the people not just with fish, but with a sense of wonder, a tangible connection to a world where magic and compassion were still possible. The legacy of the white feather was a pact of mutual protection, a bond between the world of stone and hearth and the world of myth and myth, a bond that would echo through the generations to come. The tides of years. The years turned with the slow, inevitable rhythm of the tides. On the high ridge, the Wulver remained a constant, its shaggy form a familiar silhouette against the changing skies. It watched the children of the village grow. The toddler in Ian and Moira's croft, whose hungry cries had first spurred the Wulver into action, became a sturdy boy, then a lanky youth learning his father's trade upon the sea. His name was Davy, and he possessed his mother's quiet eyes and his father's strong, capable hands. The Wulver observed the passage of time upon the villagers' faces with a detached yet deeply felt understanding. It saw fine webs of lines appear around Moira's eyes, etched there by worry and laughter in equal measure. It watched Ian's shoulders, once bowed with despair, now set in a posture of hard-won resilience, though a slight stoop began to hint at the weight of endless labor. The Wulver itself did not age in the same way. Its great strength did not diminish. Its senses remained preternaturally sharp. Yet a deeper wisdom settled in its amber eyes, a knowledge carved by decades of silent observation. It understood the fleeting, precious brevity of a human life, a single, bright-burning candle next to its own slow, smoldering peat fire. Its routines adapted to the changing village. As the community grew slightly more prosperous, its direct interventions became less frequent, reserved for true moments of crisis. A failed crop, a prolonged illness, an injury that left a family without its breadwinner. Its role shifted from sustainer to protector. It was an unseen force that maintained the balance, a shepherd of both the wild landscape and the human spirits who inhabited its edges. One harsh winter, a blizzard of unprecedented ferocity descended upon the islands. The snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, driving wall of white, piling into drifts that swallowed stone dikes and buried cottages up to their roofs. The wind screamed with a voice that held no mercy. The world was reduced to a monochrome hell of white and gray. For days, the village was cut off, imprisoned by the snow. The Wulver, its thick pelt crusted with ice, moved through the maelstrom where no human could. It felt the suffering of the trapped families, the chilling fear us peat stacks dwindled and food supplies ran low. It could not fish. The sea was a roiling, frozen chaos. But it could hunt on land, a skill it used sparingly only in the most dire need. It tracked a great red deer stag, a monarch of the high moors who had been driven down to the lower slopes by the storm. The hunt was a brutal contest of endurance in the blinding snow. The Wulver followed the stag's desperate trail for miles, its own energy flagging against the elemental fury. Finally, it cornered the exhausted beast in a snow-choked gully. The confrontation was swift and sorrowful. The Wulver felt a pang of regret for the magnificent life it was taking, but the greater need of the village overrode its personal feeling. It dragged the heavy carcass through the storm, a Herculean labor that took the remainder of the day and the whole of the night. As dawn broke on the third day of the blizzard, a pale, weak light struggling through the swirling snow, the villagers of the first croft the Wulver came to awoke to find a miraculous sight. The massive body of a stag, already partially butchered, laid against their door, a mountain of life-saving meat and hide. They did not see the Wulver, but they felt its presence in the sudden, impossible gift. The meat was shared throughout the village, a communal act that staved off starvation until the storm finally broke. When the sun at last revealed the ravaged landscape, the story of the deer was told and retold, becoming a core part of the Wulver legend. It was not just a creature of the sea, it was a spirit of the land itself, one that would provide from its own kingdom in their darkest hour. Davy, now a young man, was among those who helped distribute the venison. He stood looking up at the high ridge, his face thoughtful. He had grown up with the stories, had always felt a strange, comforting certainty that the Quiet One was watching. Finding the stag had cemented that belief into unshakable faith. He felt not fear, but a profound and humbling gratitude. He made a silent vow, a continuation of the pact his parents had made, that he too would be a keeper of the secret, a guardian of the guardian. The Wulver, resting in a deep, snow-covered cave, felt the shift in the village's energy once more. The desperate fear had been replaced by a resilient, communal strength, a strength it had helped to foster. It saw the young man, Davy, looking towards its home, and it recognized the same steadfast spirit it had seen in Ian and in Elspeth. The legacy was being passed down. The thread of its story was being woven into the very fabric of their lineage. Its own long life, once a solitary vigil, was now inextricably linked to the short, bright lives of these humans. It was a connection that spanned generations, a silent conversation between the eternal hills and the fleeting, beautiful flame of mankind. The Song of the Deep. Spring, when it finally wrestled free from winter's grip, was a riot of sound and color. The peat bogs shimmered with pools of meltwater, reflecting a sky of startling blue. The air, once sharp with frost, now carried the sweet, earthy scent of blooming bog myrtle and the frantic buzzing of insects. The Wulver felt a corresponding thaw in its own spirit. The grim necessity of the winter hunt receded, and it returned to the sea, its first and truest larder. But the sea had changed, or perhaps the Wulver's perception of it had deepened over the long decades. It no longer saw the water merely a source of sustenance. It had learned its moods, its hidden languages, its ancient rhythmic soul. When it swam now, it did not just hunt, it listened. It heard the low, grinding song of the icebergs calving far to the north, a bass note felt in the teeth. It heard the clicking, chattering conversations of the dolphins that sometimes raced alongside it, their sleek bodies cutting through the waves. It learned the different voices of the tides, the desperate pull of the ebb, the gentle, nurturing push of the flow. The sea was a vast, breathing entity, and the Wulver was a single, conscious cell within its great body. One calm evening, as it floated on its back in the middle of the Vaux, watching the first stars prick the violet sky, a new song came to it. It was a sound unlike any other, a vibration that seemed to originate from the very heart of the ocean. It was a deep, complex, and profoundly melancholy melody, a weave of long, sustained notes that rose and fell like a slow, sorrowful breath. It was the song of the whales. A pod of great, long-finned pilot whales was passing through the deep channels beyond the headlands, migrating to their summer feeding grounds. Their calls, meant to communicate across miles of abyssal darkness, resonated in the Wulver's bones. The song spoke of immense journeys, of ancient memories held in vast mammalian brains, of a sadness so deep and so old it was part of the water itself. The Wulver felt a powerful kinship with this song. It too was ancient. It too carried a solitude that was both a burden and a source of strength. It swam towards the sound, not to hunt, but to commune. It stayed with the pod for hours, a dark, canine-headed shape keeping pace with the leviathans in the twilight water. They were aware of it. It could sense their immense, calm curiosity. They did not fear it, and it felt no urge to harm them. They were fellow travelers in the great blue wilderness. This connection to the deeper song of the world marked a new phase in the Wulver's life. Its existence was no longer defined solely by its relationship with the village. It was part of a much larger tapestry, a citizen of the wild world in its entirety. It began to understand its own nature not just as a guardian of men, but as a bridge between all living things, the land, the sea, the sky, and the fragile settlements of humanity perched on the edge of it all. When it returned to its high ridge that night, the whale song still echoing in its memory, its perspective had shifted. The village lights below seemed smaller, yet more precious. They were not the center of its world, but they were a vital, flickering part of it, a part it had chosen to protect. Its gifts of fish were not just acts of charity, they were an affirmation of this connection, a reminder that the bounty of the wild sea could and should sustain the human heart. Its life was a single, continuous note in the great song of the islands, a note of steadfastness, of compassion, and of a wild, enduring grace. The fading of the old guard. The relentless procession of seasons began to etch its final, deepest marks upon the first generation who had known the Wulver's quiet reign. Elspeth, the old woman who had looked into its soul from her window, now rarely left her cottage. Her body, once capable of drawing water and tending a small garden, had become a cage of brittle bones and aching joints. Her world had shrunk to the single room, the crackle of her peat fire, and the view from her window. The Wulver, in its perpetual watch, saw the gradual dimming of her light. It felt the weakening of her life force, a flickering candle in a drafty room. Its nightly patrols always included a pause by her window. It no longer left fish, for her appetite was gone, but it would leave other things: a sprig of fragrant heather in bloom, a curiously shaped and smoothed stone from the beach, a perfect brown and white speckled gull's feather. These were not gifts of sustenance, but tokens of remembrance, a silent language that said, "I am here, you are not forgotten." One evening, it found her at the window, waiting. Her face was pale and translucent, like parchment, but her eyes were clear. She gestured for it to come closer. The Wulver, after a moment of hesitation, stepped into the pool of soft lantern light falling from the window. "I am for the long night soon," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I have no fear of it, but you must continue." The Wulver made its low, rumbling sound, a vibration of reassurance. "They know you now," she continued, her gaze looking past it into the gathering darkness. "The young ones, they have their own lives, their own worries. Do not let their busyness make you think you are not needed." The world grows louder. The quiet things, they are the first to be forgotten, or worse, misunderstood. You are the quietest thing of all. She reached a trembling, skeletal hand through the open window. The Wulver, in an act of profound trust, lowered its great, shaggy head. Her fingers, cold and light like bird bones, touched the thick fur between its ears. It was a benediction, a passing of the torch. "Thank you," she breathed, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of gratitude. 2 days later, the Wulver felt a sudden, sharp absence on the wind, a silence where a familiar, gentle presence had been. It knew, with a certainty that needed no confirmation, that Elspeth was gone. That night, it did not patrol. It sat on the ridge, its gaze fixed on her dark, silent cottage. It felt a new, hollow ache, a loneliness it had not experienced since its first nights upon the earth. It had witnessed death countless times in the wild, the swift, necessary end of the hunt, the slow decline of an old ram. But this was different. This was the loss of a consciousness that had understood it. At her funeral, the whole village gathered by the small, windswept kirkyard. The Wulver watched from a distant knoll, hidden by a stand of stunted pines. It awed the grief on the faces of Ian and Moira, now themselves showing the gray threads of middle age. It awed Davy, a full-grown man holding his own young son in his arms. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the ground, the Wulver awed the old woman's family place something upon the fresh-turned earth. Among the simple wildflowers, it awed a single, perfect white feather. The message was clear. The story would be told. The pact would be honored. The Wulver's work continued, but a new layer of melancholy tinged its vigil. It was a reminder that its long life was a tapestry woven with threads of shorter, brighter lives. Each connection, each act of kindness was a thread that would eventually snap, leaving a ghostly echo in the weave. It was the price of its guardianship, a sorrow as deep and constant as the whale song, a part of its existence it had learned to carry. The new shepherd. Davy, raised on stories of the Quiet One, had inherited his father's skill with the sea and his mother's quiet faith. He was a man of few words, but his eyes missed little. He had taken over his father's boat, and with a young family of his own, he felt the weight of the legacy more acutely than anyone. He was the new shepherd, the one who would ensure the myth remained a living, breathing secret, not a forgotten fairy tale. His relationship with the Wulver was different from his father's. Ian's had been born of desperate gratitude. Davy's was one of ingrained, mutual respect. He never sought the creature out, but he was always aware of its presence. He would notice the lack of otter tracks on a certain stretch of beach, knowing it was the Wulver's preferred path to the Voe. He would see a fish left on the step of a struggling family and would simply nod to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of the ongoing balance. One afternoon, a crisis emerged that required a new kind of collaboration. A child, Davy's own nephew, a curious boy of 7 named Robbie, had wandered away from the village while chasing a butterfly. The weather, which had been mild, began to turn. A thick, chilling fog rolled in from the sea, the same kind of treacherous horror that had shrouded the confrontation with Magnus Tate. The boy was missing. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the village. The men gathered with lanterns and ropes, their calls swallowed by the muffling gray. Davy's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum of paternal fear. He looked towards the high ridge, invisible in the fog, and a desperate idea formed in his mind. He broke away from the search party and ran to his boat, pulled up on the shingle beach. From a hidden compartment, he took the one thing he had that might serve as a signal. It was a large, beautifully preserved cod skull, bleached white by sun and salt, that had been left on his own doorstep the winter his first son was born. He had always kept it, a talisman of the guardian's blessing. He carried it to a flat rock at the edge of the moor, a place that felt old and silent. He laid the cod skull upon the rock, a stark white shape against the dark, wet stone. Then he did something he had never done before. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, not a name, but a single, clear note that cut through the dense air, a long, rising call that was part plea, part prayer. On the ridge, the Wulver heard it. The sound was different from the panicked shouts of the other searchers. It was deliberate, meant for its ears alone. It stood, its senses expanding, pushing through the fog. It could not see, but it could feel. It could feel the cold, the damp, the frantic energy of the searching men. And then, farther away, a small, fading spark of warmth and fear. A tiny heartbeat, quick and light, like a captured bird's. It moved. It flowed down the hillside, a swift, silent shadow in the opulent world. It bypassed the stumbling, shouting men, its course a straight, unerring line towards that fading spark. It found the boy huddled under a rocky overhang, his knees drawn to his chest, sobbing quietly. He was cold and terrified, but unharmed. The Wulver approached slowly, making its presence known with a soft, rumbling exhale. The boy looked up, his eyes wide. He saw the large, dark form, the shaggy fur beaded with moisture, the 2 points of amber light in the gloom. But he had been raised on the right stories. He knew this was not a monster to be feared. "Quiet one?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. The Wulver nodded its great head. It moved closer and nudged the boy gently with its muzzle, a gesture of reassurance. Then it turned and began to walk, looking back to make sure the boy followed. It led him, a phantom guide in the fog, down a path only it could see, until the anxious shouts of the search party grew loud and the lanterns became fuzzy yellow orbs in the mist. Just before they broke into the circle of light, the Wulver stopped. It looked at the boy, then melted back into the wall of fog, disappearing us completely as if it had never been. Robbie ran the last few yards into the arms of his weeping mother. "The quiet one," he cried, his fear replaced by wonder. "He found me. He led me back." Davy stood a little apart, his eyes searching the impenetrable gray. He saw nothing, but he looked towards the rock where he had left the cod skull. It was gone. In its place was a fresh, glistening ling, left us a reciprocal gift, an acknowledgement of the trust that had been placed in it. Davy felt a surge of profound emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a fierce protective pride. The pact was not just intact, it had been strengthened, tested, and proven in the heart of a new generation's crisis. The Wulver was not a relic of the past. It was a living, active guardian, and he, Davy, was its human counterpart. The new shepherd had found his way, and the old spirit had accepted him. The scar upon the land. The world beyond the islands was changing. Whispers of it had always come on the wind, carried by traders and the rare letter from relatives who had emigrated to the south. But now, the change arrived in a more tangible form. A man from the government in Edinburgh, a surveyor with brass-tipped tools and a roll of crisp vellum maps, appeared in the village. He was polite, efficient, and his eyes held a cold, calculating light that reminded the older villagers, with a shiver, of Magnus Tight. His purpose, he explained, was to chart the land for a new road, a proper, metalled road that would connect the village to the larger townships to the south. Progress, he called it, a boon for trade and communication. The Wulver, from its high ridge, watched the man's activities with a deep, growing unease. It saw him driving metal stakes into the earth, stretching lines of twine between them, and making marks in a leather-bound book. The proposed route of this progress cut directly through the heart of the Wulver's territory. It would slice across the high moor where the red deer grazed, bridge the very voe where it hunted, and run like a raw gray scar within sight of its own high ridge. This was not a single greedy man to be faced down and frightened away. This was a slow, grinding force, an ideology that saw the land not as a living, breathing entity to be respected, but as a resource to be mapped, measured, and conquered. The Wulver felt the threat on a scale it had never before encountered. Its entire world, the ancient, silent landscape that was its body and soul, was being scheduled for dissection. It began to witness the first incursions. Teams of men with picks and shovels arrived, carving a rough track along the surveyed line. The sound of their labor, the clang of metal on stone, the shouts, the percussive blast of gunpowder used to shatter larger rocks was a constant, jarring dissonance in the Wulver's silent world. The scent of crushed heather and torn earth was a violation. Animals fled the area. The paths the Wulver had used for decades were obliterated. Its movements became constrained, its hunts more difficult. It was forced to travel under the cover of deepest night, a ghost navigating a world being remade by day. It felt a new kind of vulnerability, not to a musket ball, but to the sheer, impersonal momentum of this new human endeavor. How could it stand against an idea? How could it protect the silence from the determined roar of progress? One evening, it found itself looking down upon a section of the newly cut track. The raw, red earth gaped like a wound. A deep sadness settled in its chest, a grief for the lost wholeness of its home. It was not anger, but a profound sorrow, the feeling a parent might have watching a beloved child being irrevocably changed by a harsh world. It did not try to sabotage the work. That would be a fleeting, futile gesture. Instead, it adapted. It learned the new rhythms of the road builders, their schedules, their habits. It found new, more secret paths through the remaining wilderness, corridors of heather and rock that the surveyors had deemed too difficult to bother with. Its existence became a testament to resilience, a demonstration that the wild could persist, even if it had to retreat, to become smaller and more cunning. The road was built. It was a smooth, gray ribbon that snaked through the once pristine landscape. Carts began to use it, and with them came more strangers, more outside influences. The village was changing, becoming more connected, but also less unique, its isolation broken. The Wulver's legacy was now under a different kind of threat, not from a man who wanted to kill its body, but from a world that threatened to make its spirit obsolete. Its gifts of fish continued, but they felt like smaller acts in the face of this vast, impersonal change. It was a keeper of an old magic in a new age, and for the first time in its long, long life, it felt the creeping chill of its own potential irrelevance. The weight of winters. Decades piled upon decades like layers of peat, each one compressing the one beneath into something darker, denser. The Wulver remained on its ridge, a fixture as permanent as the stone itself. Yet the passage of time, once a gentle stream, now felt like a relentless river carrying it towards a sea it could not name. It had watched Davy's hair turn the color of winter frost, had seen his own children grow and have children of their own. The village was now populated by the great-grandchildren of those it had first known. Its own body, while still formidable, began to speak a new language. In the deepest cold of winter, a dull ache would settle into its joints, a stiffness that took longer to shake off with each passing year. Its legendary strength, while still far beyond that of any mortal creature, was no longer an infinite well. After dragging a stranded sheep from a snowdrift, it would need to rest for a full day, its great lungs heaving, the fire in its muscles banked to a slower burn. Its senses, once capable of pinpointing a single vole beneath 2 feet of snow, began to lose their razor's edge. The world became slightly softer, slightly more muted. The symphony of scents on the wind was now a chorus with a few faint voices missing. It was not a failure, but a gentle fading, a slow drawing in of its awareness from the farthest horizons to the more immediate world around it. The new road had brought many changes, but it had not erased the need for its kindness. There were still those who fell through the cracks of this new, more connected world: the elderly on a fixed pension, the family struck by illness, the fisherman who lost his boat to a storm. For these people, the Wulver's gifts were still a miracle, but the act of providing them became more laborious. The swims in the cold Voe were longer. The climb back to the village with a heavy fish was a slower, more deliberate journey. It began to rely more on its deep knowledge of the land rather than its pure physical prowess. It knew where the oldest, wisest fish hid in the deepest pools. It knew the secret, sheltered bays where shellfish were plentiful. It used cunning and patience where once it might have used speed and power. One bitter night, with a gale screaming in from the north, it was delivering a basket of mussels to an old woman, the granddaughter of Elspeth, when a fit of coughing seized it. It was a deep, rattling sound that came from its core, forcing it to its knees in the lee of her cottage. The cough shook its entire frame, a violent, unfamiliar convulsion that spoke of a body that was no longer entirely its own servant. When the fit passed, it leaned its great, shaggy head against the cold stone wall, breathing heavily. It looked at its own hands. The thick fur now shot through with coarse, silver hairs that gleamed in the faint starlight. It was not fear it felt, but a slow, dawning acceptance. It was a part of the natural cycle, a truth it had witnessed 10,000 times in the lives of the animals and people it watched. Everything that lived aged. Everything that was born would one day die. This knowledge settled upon it not like a burden, but like a mantle of peace. Its long vigil had been a gift, not a sentence. It had seen generations of humanity live, love, struggle, and pass on. It had been a small, constant force for good in their fleeting lives. The ache in its joints and the rattle in its chest were not betrayals, but simply the final chapters of its own story. It delivered the mussels and began the long, slow climb back to the ridge. Its steps were measured, its breathing a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the wind. It did not feel diminished. It felt weighted, filled with the immense, heavy, and beautiful accumulation of its years. It was a library of memories, a walking archive of kindnesses given and connections made. The weight of winters was not a crushing force, but the dignified mass of a life fully and purposefully lived. It climbed on, a monarch returning to its throne, ready to watch over its domain for as many sunrises as it was granted. The unraveling tapestry. The world, for the Wulver, began to fray at the edges. The sharp, vivid tapestry of its perception, once woven with threads of crystal-clear scent, pinpoint sound, and boundless physical certainty, started to show subtle signs of wear. It was not a sudden blindness or deafness, but a gentle softening, a slow retreat of the frontiers of its awareness. The first true sign was the otter. For decades, a family of otters had inhabited the same stretch of the Vaux, their playful chirps and slick, dark forms a constant part of the Wulver's twilight world. It knew their rhythms, the exact location of their holt tucked into the peat bank. Then, one season, they were gone. Not just moved on, but vanished. The Wulver only realized their absence when it noticed the profound silence from their part of the shore. A silence that had likely existed for weeks before its dulling senses had registered the loss. It was a small, quiet thread pulled from the weave, leaving a barely perceptible gap. Its memory, once a perfect, unclouded pool reflecting every moment of its long life, developed gentle, swirling eddies. It would set out to check on a particular croft, one it had aided for generations, and find itself standing on the high moor, its purpose momentarily adrift in the fog of its own mind. The names of the humans, which it had never spoken but had held as distinct vibrational patterns in its consciousness, began to blur. The young man with the limp was the grandson of the fisherman with the burned hand, or was it the other way around? The intricate web of lineage, which it had once tracked with the precision of a historian, became a pleasant, muddled tapestry of familiar faces and fading connections. This unraveling brought with it a new, profound emotion: confusion. The world, which had always presented itself to the Wulver with an innate, logical order, now sometimes presented puzzles. The new sounds from the road, the sputtering engine of a rare motor lorry, the ring of a bicycle bell, were jarring, inexplicable noises that had no place in its understanding of the landscape. It would watch these contraptions pass, its great head tilted, its amber eyes clouded with a struggle to categorize them. They were not horse, not cart, not boat. They were fragments of a new world intruding upon the old one it was built to inhabit. Its physical frailty became more pronounced. The climb to its high ridge, once accomplished with effortless, rolling power, was now a journey of multiple pauses. It would stop, its large hand resting on a familiar granite boulder, its chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. The wind, which had once been a companion, now bit deeper into its old bones. The thick pelt that had deflected blizzards now seemed to offer less protection, the cold finding its way down to the skin beneath. Yet, within this slow decline, its core purpose remained, a bright, unwavering ember in the gathering dusk. The instinct to provide, to guard, was the last thing to fade. It might forget a name, but it never forgot the scent of true hunger emanating from a cottage. It might get confused on the path, but it would always, eventually, find its way to the Vaux, its hands moving with their ancient, remembered skill to pluck a fish from the dark water. One afternoon, it was found by a child. Not a terrified searcher, but a little girl who had strayed from a picnic her family was having near the new road. She came upon the Wulver where it sat, resting in a sun-dappled clearing, its eyes half closed. It was so still, so enmeshed with the roots and the heather, that she thought it was a strange moss-covered rock formation. She approached, her curiosity outweighing her caution. The Wulver opened its eyes. The girl gasped, but she did not run. She saw the immense, gentle creature, the silvered fur, the eyes that held the soft, warm light of a setting sun rather than the fierce gold of its prime. It was not the fearsome, mythical beast from the exaggerated stories some of the newer villagers told. It was simply old and tired and beautiful. "Hello," she whispered. The Wulver looked at her. It did not see a specific child, a descendant of Aen or Moira. It saw Lillahi Wasalam, the universal form of a young one, a small, bright spark of life. It made its low, rumbling sound, a vibration that was now softer, more like the purr of a great cat. The girl sat down a few feet away, and for a long while they simply existed together in the clearing, the ancient myth and the modern child. She told it about her picnic, about her new shoes, about the loud motor car they had come in. The Wulver listened, not understanding the words, but understanding the tone, the simple, unburdened joy in her voice. When her father's frantic calls echoed through the trees, she stood up. "I have to go," she said. "Thank you for sitting with me." Allahi Wasalam, she turned to leave. The Wulver, with a slow, deliberate movement, picked a single, perfect bluebell that grew by its side and offered it to her. The gesture was instinctive, a final, gentle gift from the wild. The girl took it, her face breaking into a wide smile, before she ran off towards the sound of her father's voice. The Wulver watched her go. The encounter was already beginning to soften at the edges in its memory, becoming a dreamlike impression of warmth and a small, bright presence. But the feeling remained, a flicker of connection, a proof that even in its fading, its essence could still touch the world. The tapestry was unraveling, but the final threads were woven with the same quiet compassion as the first. The last gift. The final winter arrived not with a cataclysmic storm, but with a deep, penetrating cold that settled into the bones of the land and refused to leave. For the Wulver, it was a season of profound stillness. Its journeys down to the village ceased entirely. The climb was beyond it now, its body a cage of aching stiffness and weary flesh. Its world had shrunk to the high ridge, the immediate surrounding moors, and the view of the sea, which it watched with a devotion that was both a vigil and a farewell. It spent its days seated upon its familiar flat stone, its thick fur matted with frost, its amber eyes gazing out over the kingdom it had guarded for so long. The view was the same, yet utterly changed. The new road was a constant, thin scar in the distance. The village had grown. New houses built in styles unfamiliar to it. The fishing boats in the harbor were different, sleeker, with engines that chugged and sputtered. It recognized the place less and less with its eyes, but it still knew it with its spirit. This was its home. Hunger was a distant memory. Its body no longer demanded sustenance from the sea or the land. It drew its energy from the earth itself, a slow, gentle trickle that was just enough to sustain its quiet watch. It was living on the stored resonance of its own long life, the final, fading echo of the power that had pushed it from the peat bogs centuries before. It knew, with a certainty that was as natural as the turning of the tide, that this would be its last season. There was no fear in this knowledge, only a deep, encompassing peace. It had fulfilled its purpose. It had been a constant in a world of change, a gentle hand in a hard world. Its legacy was not in monuments or stories, but in the uncountable, silent acts of kindness that had woven themselves into the very history of this place. One clear, bitterly cold night, when the stars were sharp and brittle-looking in the black velvet sky, it felt a familiar pull. It was not the pull of hunger, but the pull of purpose, one last time. Its fading senses, pushed to their limit, detected a thread of distress from the village. It was a new family, ones it did not know, but the scent of their struggle, the worry of a young mother, the frustration of a father out of work, was a pattern it had learned over 100 human lifetimes. With an effort that summoned the last dregs of its great strength, the Wulver rose from its stone. Its movements were slow, stiff, a monumental effort of will over failing matter. It did not go to the Voe. It could not make that journey. Instead, it turned and walked slowly, painfully, into the heart of the high moor, to a place it had not visited in many years, a small hidden lochen, a dark, peat-stained pool sacred to the old things of the world. The water was black and perfectly still, a mirror for the cold, bright stars. The Wulver stood at its edge, its own reflection staring back, a silvered ancient king, its form barely distinguishable from the rocks and the night. It knelt, its joints protesting with soft grinding sounds. It gazed into the dark water, its eyes seeing not the surface, but the depths, the ancient, sleeping life within. It reached a trembling hand into the freezing water. It did not thrust or grab. It simply waited, its fingers suspended in the blackness, its will a gentle, inviting beacon. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, from the inky depths, a shape emerged. It was a massive, old pike, a leviathan of the fresh water, its scales like tarnished armor, its eyes ancient and knowing. It was a creature that had been old when the Wulver was young. The pike swam slowly towards the Wulver's hand, a gesture of trust between two ancient sovereigns of their respective domains. It nudged the Wulver's fingers with its broad, hard head. The Wulver did not take it. It could not. This was not a hunt. This was a request. It poured its intention into the silent communion, a final plea for the land to provide for its people. The pike seemed to understand. It hovered for a moment, then turned and vanished back into the black depths. A few moments later, it returned, followed by a smaller, sleeker pike, a fine, healthy fish. The smaller pike swam into the Wulver's waiting hand. The Wulver closed its fingers gently around the cool, living flesh. It was a light burden, but it carried the weight of its entire existence. With painstaking slowness, it rose and began the long, final descent towards the village. It moved like a sleepwalker, its body a vessel for a will that was already beginning to detach from it. It reached the new family's cottage as the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. It laid the pike, glistening with the water of the sacred lochen, upon their pristine, machine-cut doorstep. It was its last gift, not from the sea, but from the heart of the land itself, a final blessing from the wild to the world of man. Then it turned its back on the village for the last time and began the slow, arduous climb back to the ridge. It did not look back. Its work was done. The last thread of its purpose was woven. All that remained was the return. The return to the peat. The climb back to the high ridge was a pilgrimage in reverse, a slow, solemn recession from the world it had served. The Wulver's body, pushed beyond its limits by the final journey to the village, was now a shell of its former self, a vessel running on the last dregs of an ancient energy. Each step was a monumental labor, its large, bare feet dragging through the frost-rimed heather, its breath a ragged plume in the pre-dawn air. The familiar path, trodden countless times over the centuries, now seemed a foreign and arduous mountain. It did not stop to rest upon its flat stone, the throne from which it had watched over its domain. That place was for the living, for the watchful guardian. Its time for watching was over. Instead, it moved past the stone with a slow, deliberate purpose, its amber eyes fixed on a destination only it could see, a place known only to the oldest and deepest part of its spirit. It walked towards the high glen, the secluded peat bog where it had first drawn breath. The journey took what little remained of the day. The weak winter sun climbed, peaked, and began its descent, casting long, blue shadows across the hills. The Wulver paid no mind to the passage of time. Its entire being was focused on the act of movement, one foot placed carefully in front of the other, a slow, stately procession towards its end. Elias and Ka entered the glen. A profound silence descended. The ever-present wind stilled here, as if the land itself held its breath. The air was cold and heavy, smelling of damp earth and the profound, ancient stillness of undisturbed ages. The peat bog lay before it, a dark, moist expanse of sphagnum moss and sedge grass, a quilt of deep browns and greens, shimmering with trapped water. This was the womb from which it had emerged. This was the heart of the land that had given it form and purpose. It felt a pull, a magnetic draw back to the source. This was not a death, not an ending in the way the creatures of the wild understood it. It was a completion, a circle closing. It walked to the very center of the bog, the place where the earth was softest, where the water seeped up to coat its feet in cool, black liquid. It stopped and stood for a long moment, its gaze sweeping across the glen one last time. It saw the familiar contours of the hills, the way the light of the setting sun caught the edge of a distant cliff, the first brave stars pricking the violet sky. There was no regret in its heart, only a deep, abiding love for this harsh and beautiful place. Then, with a final, slow exhalation that was both a sigh and a release, the Wulver knelt in the soft peat. It did not lie down so much as it allowed itself to be received. It settled into the earth, the cool, wet embrace of the moss closing around its limbs. The process was gentle, a slow sinking, a yielding. The bog, which had once pushed it forth, now drew it back in. It felt no fear, no struggle. It felt a profound sense of homecoming. The aches in its joints eased, replaced by the cool, soothing pressure of the earth. The fatigue that had weighed upon its spirit for so long lifted, its consciousness beginning to diffuse, to spread outwards from the singular point of itself and into the wider landscape. Its amber eyes, the warm, intelligent lights that had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow, slowly closed. The last thing it saw was not the dark of the peat, but a memory, a clear, vivid image of Ian's face, transformed from despair to wonder upon finding that first fish so long ago. It was a good memory, a fitting one. Its form sank deeper, the thick, shaggy pelt becoming one with the moss and the rootlets. The peat water covered its shoulders, its chest, its face. There was no gasp, no final breath. There was only a gentle subsidence, a quiet return. The land folded itself around the Wulver, absorbing it back into its own substance. The last evidence of its physical form vanished beneath the dark, still surface. The glen was silent once more. The stars shone down on an empty bog. There was no mound, no marker, no disturbance in the earth to show where a legend had returned to its source. It was as if the Wulver had never been. And yet, the air in the glen felt different. It felt charged, watchful and deeply, deeply peaceful. The guardian was gone, but the land itself now held the memory of its watch, a permanent, gentle vigilance woven into the very soil and stone. The silence at dawn. The dawn that broke over the Shetland Isles was no different from any other. A pale gray light seeped into the sky, illuminating the same sea, the same hills, the same village clinging to the shore. But for those who knew, for the descendants of the pact, the world felt different. It felt emptier. Davy, now an old man himself, with a face like a weathered map, felt it the moment he awoke. There was a silence on the wind, an absence that was more than just the quiet of the morning. For his entire life, he had carried the subconscious awareness of the Wulver's presence, a constant, low hum in the background of his existence, as natural as his own heartbeat. This morning, that hum was gone. The silence it left behind was a physical void. He dressed slowly and went to the door of his cottage, his movements stiff with age and a new, leaden sorrow. He looked up towards the high ridge. He had done this every morning of his life, a silent greeting to the quiet one. Today, he knew he would not be seen. The familiar silhouette was absent. The ridge was just a ridge. He walked through the quiet village, the frost crunching under his boots. He saw the young family, the ones who had found the pike on their doorstep, marveling at their good fortune. They saw only a strange fish. They did not feel the profound finality of the gift. They were too new to the story. He met the eyes of other older villagers, the grandchildren of those who had known the Wulver's first miracles. They nodded to him, their faces somber. No words were needed. The knowledge passed between them, a shared, silent grief. The shepherd was gone. The watch had ended. Later that day, Davy gathered his own grandson, a boy of 10 named for his great-great-grandfather, Ian. He led him away from the village, up onto the lower slopes of the hills, to a place where the view of the high ridge was clear. "He's gone, lad," Davy said, his voice rough with emotion. "The quiet one. His work is done." The boy looked up at the empty ridge, his young face serious. Where did he go? Davy placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm. He went back into the land, into the peat and the stone. He's part of it all now. The wind you feel, the rain on your face, the strength in the soil, that's him now. He's not gone. He's just everywhere. The boy considered this, his eyes scanning the vast, beautiful landscape. The idea was not frightening, it was comforting. The guardian wasn't a person in one place anymore. He was the spirit of the place itself. The days turned into weeks, and the palpable sense of absence began to soften, replaced by a new feeling. It was not that the Wulver was forgotten, but that its presence had changed. People began to speak of it in the past tense, but with a reverence usually reserved for saints and ancestors. The story of the final pike, left for the new family, was told and retold, becoming the closing chapter of the legend. The village continued its life. The boats went out, the crops were planted, children were born, and the old passed away. The world moved on, as it always does. But a seed had been planted deep in the culture of that place, a seed that had been nurtured over centuries and was now rooted irrevocably in their identity. They were the people who had been watched over. They were the village the Wulver had chosen. And in their hearts, in the stories they told their children by the fire, in the way they looked after their own poor and struggling, the legacy lived on. The silence at dawn was not an emptiness, it was a memory. And the memory was a promise that kindness, once woven so deeply into the fabric of a place, could never truly die. It would simply change form, passing from a solitary, mythical guardian into the collective, human heart of the community it had loved. The Whisper in the Stone. A generation passed. The village, now connected by its smooth, gray road to the wider world, was a place of contradictions. Modernity hummed in the wires strung on new poles, and the sputter of motorized fishing boats mingled with the cries of gulls. Yet, in the older cottages, peat still smoldered on hearths, and the old ways were remembered. The story of the Wulver was no longer a living secret, but it had solidified into a foundational myth, a tale told to wide-eyed children and discussed by historians from the mainland with a kind of anthropological curiosity. The boy, Ian, to whom Davy had explained the Wulver's passing, was now a man in his prime. He worked as a carpenter, his hands skilled with wood, but his heart remained in the stories of the past. He felt the weight of his lineage, a direct thread back to the first Ian and Moira. He was a keeper of the flame, even if the world around him saw it as mere folklore. One summer, a team of archaeologists arrived from a southern university. They had received funding to study pre-Viking settlement patterns in the Shetland Isles. They set up their dig on the high moor, not far from the Wulver's Ridge. They were earnest, meticulous people, their hands skilled with trowels and brushes instead of nets and axes. Ian watched their work with a mixture of interest and unease. They were digging into the skin of the land, unearthing the bones of a past he felt was still breathing. They found the remnants of an ancient broch, a round stone tower from a time before written history. They catalogued shards of pottery, fragments of bone tools, and flakes of flint. One young archaeologist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, was particularly drawn to the local stories. She spent her evenings in the village pub listening to the old-timers. She heard the tales of the Wulver, not as a believer but as a folklorist, fascinated by the persistence of the myth. She saw it as a psychological construct, a manifestation of the islanders' desire for a benevolent force in a harsh environment. Ian found himself talking to her one evening, the low light of the pub glinting off the glass cases of old fishing lures. "You think it's just a story," he said, not as an accusation, but a statement of fact. Anya smiled, her intelligence evident in her dark eyes. "I think stories are never just stories, Ian. They are the DNA of a culture. They tell us what a people feared, what they valued. Your Wulver is a beautiful concept, a guardian spirit that embodies the generosity of the sea itself." Ian nodded slowly. "It's more than a concept." He didn't know how to explain the certainty that lived in his bones, the feeling he got when he stood on the high moor, a feeling of being watched over by something immense and kind. A few days later, the archaeology team made a discovery. In a section of the dig near the base of the broch, they uncovered a small sealed chamber, a niche that had been protected from the elements for millennia. Inside, carefully placed, was a collection of objects. There were beautifully worked bone fishhooks. There was a small carved stone in the shape of a cod. And there was a single large object that made Anya gasp when she carefully brushed the dirt from it. It was a skull, but it was like no skull she had ever seen. It was large, unmistakably canine in its overall structure, with a powerful jaw and strong teeth designed for catching and holding fish. Yet the cranial cavity was too large, the brow ridge subtly wrong, suggesting an intelligence that did not belong to a wolf or a dog. It was an impossible hybrid. The news spread through the village like wildfire. The archaeologists were ecstatic, talking of a new species, a unique Pleistocene relic, a scientific marvel. The villagers were silent, a strange, potent awe settling over them. Ian went up to the dig site. He stood at the edge of the trench, looking down at the skull, which now rested on a bed of clean white gauze. It was brown with age, stained by the peat, but it was undeniably real. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a story. This was a bone. Proof. Anya looked up at him, her face alight with scientific triumph. "It's incredible, Ian! It changes everything we know about the megafauna of these islands." Ian did not answer immediately. He looked from the skull to the surrounding landscape, to the high ridge, to the glen where the peat bog lay, to the distant, glittering sea. He felt a connection snap into place, a circuit completed after centuries. The myth was not a fantasy. It was a memory, a race memory of a real physical being that had lived and walked these same hills. "You're wrong," he said softly, his voice filled with a profound and certain reverence. Anya looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't change what we know," Ian said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "It confirms what we've always known." The discovery did not make the Wulver less magical for the villagers, it made it more so. The legend now had a fossilized fart. The whispers were no longer just on the wind, they were in the stone. The guardian had been real. Its bones were part of the land's own skeleton. And in that tangible, scientific proof, the myth transcended folklore and became history, a sacred history that belonged to them alone. The Wulver was no longer just a spirit, it was an ancestor. The legacy in the water. The discovery of the skull sent ripples far beyond the islands. For a time, the village was inundated with journalists, curiosity seekers, and more scientists. The skull, dubbed the Shetland anthropoid by the press, was taken to a university on the mainland for further study. The village, after the initial storm of attention, settled back into its rhythm, but it was a rhythm forever changed by the validation of its oldest truth. Ian, now the acknowledged authority on the Wulver, felt his role as keeper evolve. It was no longer about guarding a secret, it was about stewarding a truth. He worked with the local historical society to create a small, respectful exhibit in the village hall, not about the skull itself, which was gone, but about the legend and its impact on the community. The Wulver was no longer just a spirit, it was an ancestor. The legacy in the water. The discovery of the skull sent ripples far beyond the islands. For a time, the village was inundated with journalists, curiosity seekers, and more scientists. The skull, dubbed the Shetland anthropoid by the press, was taken to a university on the mainland for further study. The village, after the initial storm of attention, settled back into its rhythm, but it was a rhythm forever changed by the validation of its oldest truth. Ian, now the acknowledged authority on the Wulver, felt his role as keeper evolve. It was no longer about guarding a secret, it was about stewarding a truth. He worked with the local historical society to create a small, respectful exhibit in the village hall, not about the skull itself, which was gone, but about the legend and its impact on the community. The Wulver was no longer just a spirit, it was an ancestor. They displayed replicas of the bone fish hooks, the carved stone cod, and photographs of the landscape the Wulver had called home. The central piece of the exhibit was a large, beautifully painted mural depicting not a monster, but the gentle, shaggy creature leaving a fish on a doorstep under a starry sky. The legacy of the Wulver began to express itself in new, subtle ways. The community, empowered by the knowledge that their myth was rooted in a tangible history of compassion, became more consciously kind. A formal fund was established for families facing hardship, consciously named the Quiet Ones Fund. When a fisherman fell on hard times, his peers would anonymously leave a share of their catch in his creel. The children, raised on the now validated story, played a game called Wulver's Gift, where they would leave small, pretty stones or wildflowers on the steps of their friends' houses. The Wulver's influence had seeped into the cultural groundwater, becoming a moral compass for the community. It was a reminder that strength was for protecting, that the bounty of the world was for sharing, and that the most powerful legacies were built not of stone and conquest, but of silent, selfless acts. Years later, Dr. Anya Sharma returned to the islands. Her study of the skull was complete, her papers published. The scientific community remained divided, some calling it a bizarre mutation, others a hoax. But she knew what she had held in her hands. She had come back not as a scientist, but as a pilgrim. She found Ian, his hair now fully silver, mending a net outside his workshop. They sat together on a bench, looking out at the Vaux. "I never thanked you," Anya said, her voice quiet. "For what?" Ian asked. "For teaching me that science only tells us how something could have happened. It never tells us why." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've studied the data, the carbon dating, the morphological anomalies, but the data doesn't explain the look in your eyes when you saw that skull. It doesn't explain this." She gestured to the village around them, to the well-kept homes, the absence of visible poverty, the general atmosphere of quiet contentment. "I've studied dozens of isolated communities. None of them feel like this one." Ian smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. "That's the legacy. He's not just a story we tell, he's a way we learn to be." Anya nodded, finally understanding. The Wulver was not an extinct animal in a museum case. Its true skeleton was not made of bone, but of 1,000 accumulated acts of kindness passed down through generations. Its spine was the ridge, its ribs the stone dikes, its heart the community itself. It was us alive as it had ever been. Before she left, Anya walked up to the high ridge alone. She stood on the flat stone where the Wulver had kept its vigil for centuries. The wind tugged at her hair, and the vast, breathtaking panorama of sea and sky stretched out before her. She felt a profound peace, a sense of being in the presence of something immense and good. She reached into her pocket and took out a small, smooth stone she had picked up from the beach, a stone the color of wet earth and winter bracken. She placed it gently on the Wulver stone, a small, silent offering from a believer who had started her journey as a skeptic. As she turned to descend, she could have sworn, for just a moment, that she felt a familiar, gentle rumble in the air around her, a vibration not of sound, but of pure, benevolent presence, a whisper on the wind, a legacy in the water, an eternal, watchful kindness woven into the very fabric of the land, the keeper of the spring. The validation of the Wulver's physical existence did something profound to the collective psyche of the village. It was as if a deep, ancestral chord had been struck, resonating through the very bedrock of their identity. The story was no longer a quaint folktale. It was their origin story, a sacred narrative of their connection to the land. This newfound certainty bred a sense of responsibility that was both heavy and holy. Ian, in his later years, became more than a carpenter and a storyteller. He became a custodian. He took it upon himself to maintain the places sanctified by the Wulver's passage. He would walk the old paths, clearing away wind-blown debris from the stone where the cod skull had been laid to summon the guardian for the lost child. He would quietly repair the dry stone dikes near the high glen, his hands performing a maintenance that was both physical and spiritual. His most cherished duty was the care of the spring that bubbled up from the base of the Wulver's Ridge. The water was cold and clear, famed for its sweet taste. Local lore held that the Wulver had drunk from this spring, and that its kindness had seeped into the water itself. Ian would go there with a wooden bucket and a bristle brush, meticulously cleaning the stone basin that caught the water, ensuring it remained free of fallen leaves and silt. It was a small, quiet ritual, a form of communion with the spirit he served. One day, while cleaning the spring, he noticed a change. The flow of water had weakened to a trickle. Alarmed, he investigated further, his old fingers tracing the fissures in the rock from which the water emerged. He found the problem not at the source, but farther up the slope. The new road, for all its benefits, had altered the natural drainage of the land. Runoff from a recent rainstorm, carrying oil and grit from the tarmac, had eroded a small channel, diverting the underground seepage that fed the spring. This was not a dramatic crisis, but a slow, quiet death. The silencing of the spring felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of his duty. He tried to fix it himself, building a small dam of turf and stone to redirect the flow, but his efforts were clumsy, the work of a carpenter, not a hydrologist. The spring continued to dwindle. The potential loss of the spring struck a deeper chord in the community than even the discovery of the skull. The skull was history, the spring was life. Its water was in their tea, their broth, their whiskey. It was a daily, tangible connection to the myth that sustained them. Its failure felt like a wound to the soul of the place. A meeting was called in the village hall, not by the council, but by the people. Ian stood before them, his voice thick with emotion as he explained what was happening to their spring, to the Wulver spring. He did not need to embellish. The truth was dire enough. A young woman, a geologist who had returned to the islands after university, stood up. Her name was Aelid, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of the old woman, Elspeth. "It's the watershed," she explained, drawing a quick diagram on a chalkboard. "The road has acted like a knife, cutting the land's veins. We can fix it, but it will require more than turf and stone. It will require proper engineering and permission from the council." What followed was a quiet revolution. Petitions were written. The local council, initially dismissive, was swayed by the sheer unified passion of the village. Elid designed a simple, elegant solution, a subsurface French drain that would capture the diverted runoff and guide it back to its original course, healing the land's wound without damaging the road. The day the work began, it was not done by a contracted crew alone. The entire village turned out. Old men like Ian, their hands garled by a lifetime of labor, worked alongside young mothers and university students. They moved earth, they laid gravel, they positioned the perforated piping with a care that was almost reverent. It was not a construction project, it was a ceremony. They were not just mending a water source, they were suturing a tear in their shared history. When the last stone was placed and the turf was carefully rolled back into place, a silence fell over the group. They waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint, gurgling sound emerged from the mouth of the spring. It grew stronger, more confident. A clear ribbon of water, then a steady stream, began to flow once more into the stone basin, washing away the last of the dirt, running clean and cold and sweet. A cheer went up, not loud and raucous, but deep and heartfelt. Ian knelt, his old knees cracking, and cupped his hands in the water. He drank deeply. It tasted of the peat, of the stone, of memory itself. He looked around at the faces of his community, young and old, their faces alight with a shared triumph. The Wulver had taught them to care for each other. Now they had learned to care for the Wulver's world. The keeper had become the kept, and the legacy had found its most powerful form yet, not in receiving kindness, but in becoming its active collective source. The tide of a new storm. The peace that followed the healing of the spring was a deep and resonant one, but the world beyond the islands remained a place of tumultuous change. A new kind of storm was brewing, one that did not gather in the sky, but in the ledgers of distant corporations and the policies of faraway governments. News, traveling faster now along wires and through the air, began to carry ominous whispers. A large international consortium had identified the deep, cold waters off the Shetland coast as a prime location for a new, immense fish farm. The project promised jobs, investment, a new economic boom. To the village, it promised ruin. Ian, now so old he seemed to be made of the same weathered stone as the dikes he maintained, felt a familiar dread, a cold echo of the feeling he'd had when the road builders first arrived. This was Magnus Tate on a global scale, a hunger not for a single pelt, but for the very lifeblood of the sea. He remembered the Wulver's connection to the water, the way it had listened to the song of the whales, the way it had understood the sea as a living, breathing entity. This fish farm was not a part of that natural order. It was an industrial imposition, a factory that would pollute the Vaux, spread disease to the wild fish stocks, and drown out the ancient rhythms with the constant thrum of machinery. A public meeting was called by the corporation in the village hall. A smooth-talking executive in a sharp suit stood where Ian had once stood, pointing to glossy charts that showed wealth and progress. He spoke of tonnage and profit margins, of sustainable aquaculture and community grants. His words were a sleek, modern vessel, but his scent, carried on the air to Ian's old, keen nostrils, was the same old scent of greed. When the floor was opened for questions, the village did not respond with angry shouts. They responded with stories. Elid, the geologist, stood and presented her own charts, detailing the delicate tidal flows and the unique ecosystem of their Vaux that would be choked by waste. A fisherman stood and spoke not of money, but of the cod and the haddock, the soth and the ling, describing them not as resources, but as old neighbors, each with their own habits and paths, a community beneath the waves that his family had known for generations. Then Ian rose. He moved slowly to the front of the hall, leaning heavily on his carved walking stick. He did not look at the executive. He looked at the people of his village. "They talk of the future," Ian began, his voice a dry rustle that commanded absolute silence. "But they have no memory. We do. We remember a time when the sea turned its back on us. We remember the hunger that bites deeper than any winter cold. And we remember what saved us." He paused, letting the weight of the unspoken name fill the room. It wasn't a government grant or a corporate scheme. It was a kindness from the wild. This thing they want to build, it isn't just a threat to our fishing. It's an insult to that kindness. It is a refusal of the gift we were given. He turned his gaze to the executive, his eyes the same clear, piercing blue they had always been. "You cannot understand this because you do not listen to the water. You do not know the song of the whales. You see a map. We see a life. This is not just our home. It is his legacy, and we will not let you poison it." The meeting ended not with a vote, but with a quiet, solid resolve. The village became the rock against which the corporation's tide broke. They organized, they wrote letters, they used the modern tools of the world they often distrusted to fight for the ancient values they cherished. They enlisted biologists and filmmakers who came and documented the pristine beauty of the Vaux and the unique culture of the village. The story of the Wulver, now backed by archaeological fact and this new, passionate defense, became a powerful symbol in their campaign. They were not protesters, they were guardians. The battle was long and arduous, fought in council chambers and newspaper columns. But the unity of the village, forged in the fires of their shared history, was unbreakable. They were not fighting for a view, They were fighting for a soul. Finally, after a year of struggle, the corporation, faced with relentless opposition and mounting bad publicity, withdrew its plans. The victory was celebrated, but quietly, with a profound sense of relief rather than triumph. They had not won a prize. They had prevented a desecration. That night, Ian walked down to the shore. The Vaux lay calm and dark, the water a perfect mirror for the star-strewn sky. He could hear the gentle lap of the waves, the distant cry of a gull, the deep, essential silence of a world left in peace. He knew then that the Wulver's final gift was not the fish, nor the rescued children, nor even the validated legend. Its final gift was this: the unshakable knowledge in the hearts of its people that some things are too sacred to be sold, that the wild has a value beyond money, and that the duty of the strong is to protect the gentle, the quiet, and the kind. The Wulver was gone, but its people had learned to roar with its voice, a voice not of anger, but of an unwavering, protective love for the world it had left in their care. The seed in the snow. Ian's time, like the Wulver's before him, was drawing to a close. The great, slow-moving clock of his life was counting down its final measures. He no longer walked to the high ridge or even to the spring, his world having contracted to the single room of his cottage, the view from his window, and the crackling peat fire that mirrored the smoldering embers of his own vitality. His body was a landscape of aches and frailties, a map of a long and purposeful journey nearing its end. He was not afraid. The Wulver had shown him the shape of a good ending, not a failure, but a completion. He spent his days in a chair by the window, a thick wool blanket, a gift from the community, draped over his knees. His hands, which had carved wood and mended nets, now lay still, their work done. His eyes, still sharp and blue, watched the world outside, the children playing, the fishing boats returning, the weather changing over the sea. The village treated his passing with the same reverence they had once reserved for the Wulver's presence. They did not see a dying old man. They saw a living library, the final, direct link to the source of their story. People would visit not out of pity, but to pay their respects. They would bring him soup, not because he needed it, but because the act of giving was the language of their culture. They would sit with him in comfortable silence, or tell him small pieces of village news, understanding that he was stitching the present into the vast tapestry of the past he held within him. Aelid, his great-grandniece, was his most frequent visitor. She would read to him from her geological surveys, her words about watersheds and granite formations, a strange and beautiful poetry. She understood that Anne was a natural feature of the land, as much as any cliff or spring, a human hill that had witnessed epochs. One afternoon, with a light snow beginning to fall, dusting the world in a soft, quiet white, Ian gestured for Aelid to come closer. His voice was a whisper, a breath of wind through dry grass. "The box," he said, his eyes flicking towards the old sea chest at the foot of his bed. "Under the wool." Aelid went to the chest. She moved aside the carefully folded sweaters, their wool smelling of peat smoke and lavender. Her fingers found a small, wooden box, its surface smooth and dark with age. She brought it to him. With trembling hands, Ian opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were not jewels or coins, but a collection of humble, powerful relics. There was the bleached white cod skull, the one his grandfather Davy had used to summon the Wulver in the fog. There was the single, perfect white sea eagle feather left for Elspeth. There was a small, smooth stone, the color of wet earth and winter bracken. And there was a brittle, pressed bluebell, its color faded to a memory of purple. "This is not for a museum," Ian whispered, his gaze locking with Aelid's. "This is for the keeper, The story, it doesn't live in the telling. It lives in the doing. It lives in the spring you mended, in the vow you protected. He closed her fingers around the box. You are the keeper now. Elid felt the weight of the box, and the immense, beautiful weight of what it represented. It was not unburden, it was a commissioning. She was being given the compass for the soul of her home. Later that night, as the snow fell thicker, blanketing the village in a profound silence, Ian's breathing grew slow and shallow. He was not in pain. He was dreaming. He dreamt he was walking on the high moor, but he was young again, his body strong and tireless. Ahead of him, walking with a slow, rolling gait, was a large, dark figure. He could not see its face, but he saw the thick, shaggy pelt, the powerful shoulders. He felt no need to catch up or to call out. He simply followed, a sense of profound peace washing over him. The figure led him to the edge of the peat bog in the high glen, then turned and looked at him. The eyes were warm amber, flecked with gold, and they held a deep, timeless kindness. The Wulver inclined its head in a slow, deliberate gesture of recognition, of welcome. Then it turned and stepped into the bog, sinking gently into the earth, until it was gone. Ian took one last, deep breath, the air smelling of peat and cold starlight, and then he followed. The snow continued to fall, covering his cottage, covering the paths, covering the high ridge. It was a gentle, forgiving blanket, tucking the old keeper in for his long rest. Inside the cottage, on the table by the empty chair, the small wooden box sat, waiting. The legacy had not died with the man. It had been passed on, a seed planted in the deep snow, waiting for the spring. The unbroken circle. The spring that followed Ian's passing was one of exceptional beauty. The thaw came gently, and the land erupted in a vibrant, green celebration. The heather bloomed a brilliant purple, the bog myrtle sweetened the air, and the Wulver spring flowed stronger and clearer than it had in years, as if the land itself was honoring its departed steward. Elid, now the acknowledged keeper, felt Ian's absence like a change in atmospheric pressure. But the weight of the wooden box was a comfort, not a chain. She did not keep its contents hidden. One evening, she gathered the village children around the stone basin of the spring. She did not tell them a story, she showed them the relics. She let them touch the smooth cod skull, feel the softness of the eagle feather, hold the cool, dark stone. This isn't a history lesson, she told their earnest, upturned faces. This is a toolkit. This feather is for remembering to be brave and free. This stone is for remembering to be strong and grounded. This skull is for remembering to share what the world gives you. And this flower, she said, pointing to the pressed bluebell, is for remembering to be kind, even to strangers. She was teaching them the language of the legacy, not as a tale of something that was, but a set of instructions for something that is. The legacy began to manifest in ways both new and timeless. The children, inspired, started a Wulver's garden, a small patch of land where they grew vegetables for the elderly who could no longer tend their own. The success of the community in fighting the fish farm had given them a taste of their own power, a power rooted in unity and a love for their home. They formed a formal conservation trust, with Elid at its head, dedicated to monitoring the health of the Voe and the surrounding lands, ensuring no future threat would ever catch them unawares. The story of the Wulver, once a secret, then a validated myth, was now a civic principle. It was referenced in council meetings when discussing aid for struggling families. It was the inspiration for a local artist's stunning sculpture of the creature, not us a fearsome beast, but us a gentle, seated figure looking out to sea, which was placed near the harbor as a quiet reminder. Tourists would ask about it, and the villagers would tell a simplified, warm version of the tale, a version that spoke of kindness, never mentioning the skull or the specific miraculous gifts. The deepest truths were still for them alone. One evening, at the annual summer festival, a new tradition was born. As bonfires lit up the twilight and the smell of roasting fish filled the air, Eilid stood before the community. She held the wooden box. "We tell the story of the Wulver," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crackle of the flames and the murmur of the crowd. "But tonight, we will do something new. We will tell the story of us. We will tell the story of how the Wulver's kindness became our own." One by one, people stood up. A fisherman told of how his crew had secretly repaired a rival's damaged nets. A young mother told of how a basket of groceries had appeared on her step when her husband was ill. An elderly man told of how a group of teenagers now came every week to cut his peat for him. Story after story unfolded, not of grand dramatic rescues, but of small, daily human kindnesses. They were stories of fish left on doorsteps, translated into the modern vernacular of their lives. The Wulver was not a character in these stories, it was the genre. Its spirit was the common thread, the moral framework that had shaped their community's soul. The circle was unbroken. The solitary, mythical guardian had successfully worked itself out of a job by inspiring an entire community to become guardians themselves. Alayhi salam, the fires burned low, and the stars emerged, sharp and clear in the northern sky. A deep, contented silence fell over the gathering. The waves whispered on the shore, the same rhythm that had lulled the Wulver to sleep on its ridge for centuries. The legacy was no longer a thing to be protected. It was the very air they breathed, the water they drank, the bond that held them together. The Wulver was gone, but its work was complete. It had not just left fish for the poor. It had planted a seed of compassion in the hard soil of a remote island, and over centuries, that seed had grown into a forest of kindness, its roots now so deep and so strong that no storm, no stranger, and no corporation could ever hope to tear it out. The story had reached its end, but the living of it would continue forever.